Hi, this is Claudia Chase from Mirrix Looms, and today I am going to show you how to weave beads on the Mirrix loom. As you can see here, we have a 16-inch loom, and it's set up for weaving beads without the shedding device on the left and weaving beads with the shedding device on the right. The wonderful thing about the Mirrix loom is you have the opportunity to weave in either of those manners, and as you can see, you can do it on the same loom at the same time. Why invest in a Mirrix loom? Well, the answer is, first of all, we have 8 different sizes, ranging from the itty-bitty mini loom to the huge 38-inch loom. All of those looms can be used for weaving beads. The wonderful thing about the Mirrix loom is that when you warp it, your warp threads go on completely evenly. So the tension on each thread is the same because you're not having to tie pairs of threads down at the bottom and try to get them to be the same tension. The other thing is, well, this is a 16-inch loom, which is actually, a mid-size loom, but you could do a huge bead woven piece on it, and you would have the same fabulous tension at the beginning of your piece that you would have at the end. Bead looms where you have a roller mechanism that rolls up the warp threads, and these are the warp threads, the threads that are on the loom, tend to create uneven tension because the threads, as you roll them up, are aligned to the side of each other or on top of each other. So as you unroll your warp to advance your weaving, your tension is often going to get, off kilter, which is just not a good thing. You can weave beads on any size loom, and on any size loom, you can weave something as small as a ½ inch wide. So your only constraint with the looms is how big a piece you can make, not how small a piece you can make. And we're often asked that question, can I weave a 1-inch piece on the 16-inch loom? Well, here you go, of course you can. You can weave 5 1-inch pieces at the same time on the 16-inch loom. That's another amazing thing about this loom, because you know how it is. If you just have one loom, and probably you're going to want to have more than one loom, but you want to do several things at the same time sometimes. You get bored with one, or you lose interest and you want to move on to something else. So the nice thing about the Mirrix loom is that you can weave more than one piece. First thing I'm going to show you is how to weave without the shedding device. This is the shedding device, as we recall. Weaving without the shedding device is what would be known as traditional bead weaving, although that's kind of a misnomer, because in fact, Native Americans used a loom that had a sort of shedding device, I think, before what we consider traditional bead weaving was invented. So they, in fact, did something that is close to what I'm going to show you later. This kind of bead weaving, basically you're sewing your beads onto the warp threads. It's very, very simple. I am going to show you how to weave beads not using the shedding device. And the first thing I want to do before I start weaving is check my tension. And I think this is just a little bit too loose. So I'm going to turn the wing nuts, put on a little more tension. Now, the reason you want good tension is if they're baggy, when you do the process that I'm going to show you, you can actually sew under a warp thread instead of over it, and because it's too baggy. So you want it tight, not so tight that you break the warp threads. That looks pretty good to me. But as you weave, if you feel it's too loose or too tight, you can adjust it. One thing you want to remember is, because this thread is slightly stretchy, when you put a lot of tension on it, you are stretching it out. So when you take your piece off the loom, you're going to want to let it rest for a while so that the threads can go back to their normal length, which means that when you take your piece off the loom, it's going to be a little shorter than when it was on the loom. The first thing I want to do is I want to thread my needle. I'm using a tulip beading needle here. We love these needles. I'm putting about 4 feet of thread on my needle, and I'm going to temporarily tie it to the side here. I'm just going to do the first of a square knot. I'm not going to tie the rest of it because I'm going to undo that later. And I'm going to pour out some beads. Now remember, you have 1 less bead than warp threads. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 warp threads. I'm going to pick up 12 beads. See how I pick them up? You put your needle into the hole and kind of flip it over. Of course, I lost count. It's 5, 10, 11, 12. Now, in this case, we have used the bottom spring kit. For really skinny pieces, it's not necessary. Next, I'm going to place my beads in between and behind the warp threads. Next, I'm going to pull the thread through. And I'm going to sew through the top of the beads, and I'm going to sew on top of the warp, because the thread that holds the beads is behind the warp thread. And so now when I sew through the top, I have sandwiched my beads onto the warp threads. It's that simple. Next, I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to tie these two ends together as tight as I can. Remember, the beads are glass, and so you can't tie it too tightly, and this will establish the beginning width of my piece. Before I take the piece off the loom, or even after it's off the loom, it doesn't matter, I will sew this thread back through a couple of the beginning rows. And by the way, if you couldn't see what I was doing, this thread had been tied to the sidebar with the loose knot, and I just undid that. Okay, so now we're tied on. Now I am using size 11OC beads, and we're using the 14 dent spring because there are approximately 14 of those beads per inch, and so that's why I'm using that spring. Let's try a different color. Bead weaving is really very simple. Because the loom provides such fabulous tension, it's really easy to weave and make the piece look great. Much easier than off loom work, which is another reason why one would like to use a loom. Okay, once again, I have put my beads on the needle, and I'm putting them behind and in between the warp threads. See how simple that is? And because this loom is vertical, I find it so much easier to work with than a horizontal loom, because it's like looking at a canvas instead of looking down at something. And once again, I'm going to sew through the tops of the beads. I'm approaching this from a very weird angle from the side so you can see better, but it's really easy to do. Let's do another color. Let's do purple. So what you really, because bead weaving is so simple, it's your design that matters most of all. You know, the weaving is easy, and things come out perfectly because the tension on this loom is so great. See, I threaded up one too many beads, so I'm just going to take it off my needle, and I'm going to put my beads in between and behind. Now, see, I've got to make sure they really are there, because you don't want one of your warp threads to not get sewn in front of. And if that does happen when the piece is off the loom, you can use a thread and needle, a thread and needle? Yeah, either way, and correct the problem. But yeah, it's better just to avoid that mistake. You can see if the bead pushes back some, I could actually be sewing through the back of the warp thread, but I don't want to do that. That's all you do. We have a wonderful tutorial on how to begin and end thread, so I'm not going to show that to you right now. We're weaving a very thin piece here, but you could be potentially weaving a really wide piece. One thing I suggest, if you're not using the shedding device and weaving a really wide piece, you probably want to use the extra warping bar kit, which allows you to not have warp on the back of your loom. The reason for that would be it's much easier to get your hand, or possible to get your hand behind a wide warp if you don't have the threads on the back. But the one other thing I want to show you is, let's say this were a wider piece, And I was having, it's not always so easy to get all those beads set in place all at the same time. So if I were weaving a wider piece, I could weave smaller groups of beads at the same, instead of all at once here. So, and then set these in place. And in fact, sometimes for a wider piece for the first row, that's almost necessary. You don't have to weave them all in all at once. I mean, your needle's only so big, right? So if you have a piece the whole width of the loom, you almost have to do that. Next, I'm going to show you how to weave using the shedding device. Next, I'm going to show you how to weave beads using the shedding device. This is the shedding device, this thing. And half of the threads, you have 2 threads in each dent. Half of the threads are connected to the top bar here, and the other half are connected to the bottom bar here. And the reason it's called a shedding device is it makes a shed. And the word shed, which is a very, very old word, means the space between the lowered and raised warps. This is a weaving term. And in fact, in this case, you are actually weaving your beads. You're not sewing them onto the warp. When you use the loom to weave without the shedding device, you will have twice as many weft threads, in other words, the thread that goes to the beads, and half the number of warp threads. The opposite is true with the shedding device, because you will have twice as many warp threads. You will only pass through the shed once, and you won't be weaving back. For a very heavy, wide, large bead piece, having twice as many warp threads actually makes it a lot stronger. The first thing I'm going to do, once again, is I'm going to tie to the side bar with the first part of a square knot. There are 18 warp threads here. Now, even though I'm using the shedding device, my first row has to be sewn on in the manner of weaving that we do here. If you don't, well, first of all, it creates a base from which you can start weaving. So if you don't do that, you will not be able to weave. The other reason is when you take your piece off, because it's the threads, the warp threads that are holding, the crossing of the warp threads hold your beads in place. If you didn't sew in your first row, it would just start to fall apart. I'm going to pick up 17 beads because we have 18 pairs of warp threads. 15, 16, 17. The nice thing about having the bottom spring kit is it separates the pairs of warp threads very efficiently. You can do it without the bottom spring kit, but it really does make it easier. If you're doing a wide piece, it's almost necessary because it can get so difficult to put in that first row. So just like for the piece on the left, I'm going to put my beads in between and behind the pairs of warp threads. Now, if you are having a difficult time getting them all set in place at once, you can do what I showed you on the other piece, which is just weave a section, smaller sections at a time. And here I go, I'm going to sew through. It's going to be a little more difficult because I have double warp thread, so it's thicker. And I'm going to pull it out part way because I want to really make sure that I'm sewing through correctly. Making sure that I don't go behind the warp threads. Here, that bead will go back in place, I promise. Now I'm going to untie from the sidebar. My thread's a little bit long because that sidebar was pretty far away, so I'm going to pull my thread through a little bit more. Now I'm going to tie that knot once again. In fact, I'm going to push it down a little bit. Tie that knot. And we are ready to start weaving using the shedding device. Here we go, I'm going to even out that row. This is so much fun. The first thing I need to do is I need to make a shed. I can either make a shed by starting on the bottom or the top. It really doesn't matter. But we do alternate. So the next row, if I start on the bottom here, the next row I'll be going to the top. We will be weaving from left to right and right to left. That's another huge difference with using the shedding device. when you're creating a pattern, you have to remember to read your pattern from left to right and right to left. Your first couple of rows, sometimes the warp threads stick a little, maybe because the heddles are crossed, various reasons. That works out after a couple rows that you're not going to have that problem. But so I like to go like this and just check it and make sure half the threads are raised and half the threads are raised and half the threads are lowered. Now I'm going to put my beads and my needle in between the raised and lowered threads. I don't like to keep my beads on the needle because that makes it harder to set them in place. What I do then is I make a loop on this side, and I hold it like that, and I hold this side, and I put my beads in between and behind the top layer of warp threads, and then I just scoot those beads right down like that and pull, and that's all there is to it. So you can see that weaving with the shedding device in fact is easier. Can't make any mistakes. I need to change the shed. If I don't, you won't be unweaving. You won't see your beads unweaving because they are caught between the warp threads. So they might not unweave, but you will notice that they are not attached to the right thread. To check to see whether or not I need to change my shed, because sometimes you forget or you've walked away from your piece and come back to it. If you can raise the beads easily, that means you haven't changed your shed. You'll see the difference. I'm changing my shed. That's how you do it. You just hold on to that. It's really easy to do. Now it's hard for me to raise my beads because they have the warp threads crossed above them. I'm going to be weaving this from right to left. And first, as I said, I want to make sure nothing's sticking there, because I saw one was sticking there. That's a problem. Nothing is sticking now. Take my needle, pull it through. I have my loop on one side, and I'm holding the needle end of it. I have my beads in between and behind the first layer of warp, which is just like when you do the sewing in method, except the difference is then I just push them down and pull the thread through. That is easy. It really is easy. Going to change my shed once again. I just hold the side of the loom, stick the handle behind. And now I'm going to show you what to do if you have a really wide piece and you want to lay your beads in sections. Going to stick them in the shed. I'm going to put them in place. See how easy? And it's just amazing. And then I'm just going to take a loop here, make a loop here after to the right of the last warp thread that's next to a bead. Now I need to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I need to do 7 more, so obviously I had 10 there. Sometimes it's just hard if your piece is the width of the loom to lay in all those beads at once, and this is how you make it easy. Now I have my loop and the needle side of the thread, and I just take those last beads and I lay them in there and I pull, and that's how you do that. You'll weave your entire piece using the shedding device. Your last row is going to be identical to your first row. You're going to put your shedding device in a neutral position, which means 1 bar on the top and 1 bar on the bottom, not in front of you. And you're going to put your threaded beads in between and behind the double strands of warp, and you're going to sew through it. Because once again, if you don't do that and you take your piece off the loom, it will fall apart. And again, just like with the piece on the left, when you take your piece off, you want to let it rest for a little bit so the warp threads can unstretch. If you tie it off right away and your warp threads have been stretched a lot, you can get some puckering, and you don't want that. You want your piece to be perfect. What we found is that a piece using the shedding device, even though they're double the number of threads, and we've used Ceylon D here, which works great with most beads, we find that the thread does not show at all, because even though you have double the threads, they're in between the beads, and you can see there really is no visible difference between these two weavings. That's how you weave using the shedding device. Now I bet all of you are going to want to try that.